This is my favorite cheap speaker, the Cambridge Audio SX50. And this is my favorite bookshelf speaker. Well, one of them. The Sonus Faber Lumina 2 Amateurs, and it comes in at $1,500. They both have similar sized drivers, and they both kind of sound very similar, but they have a very dissimilar price tag. So can the Cambridges keep up with the Sonus Fabers? Well, I don't want to ruin it, but I was actually quite surprised. So sit down, grab a cup of coffee, maybe through your new Cheap Audio Man coffee mug that's linked into the description, and let's talk about whether or not this $200 speaker can compete with a $1,500 speaker. Cheap versus expensive speaker. I was surprised. I had these both hooked up to the Weem Ultra, which was running streaming duties. That was an optical out into the Shelly Labs Daisy into the Advanced Paris A10 Classic. So we have some very expensive electronics. Weem Ultra is $330. The Daisy is $1,300, so we're at $1,630, plus $2,500 for the Advanced Paris A10 Classic. Over $4,000 of electronics, but I wanted to hear the best out of these speakers. Very interesting specs on these. The Cambridge Audio has a 5¼ inch treated paper woofer. Oh yeah. And then a 1-inch soft dome tweeter. The Sonus Fabers have almost a 6-inch woofer. It's in metric though, so it's not quite 6 inches. And then slightly over a 1-inch soft dome tweeter with some type of vertical bar that I'm assuming has something to do with making the music better. The Cambridge Audio sensitivity is claimed to be 87 dB. However, I think that might not be true because the sensitivity on the Sonus Faber Lumina 2 Amateurs is, I think, 85 or 86. So, the Cambridge should play louder than the Sonus Faber. That wasn't quite the case for me. Also, the low frequency roll-off. For the Cambridge, it's stated to be 50 Hertz on the bottom, 55 Hertz on the bottom for the Sonus Faber Lumina 2 Amateurs. This is why you can't buy speakers off of specs alone. Bass. This is a bit of a difficult one to do because there is a massive size differential and you have different woofer sizes. So naturally, the Sonus Faber has a better opportunity to have at least more impactful bass, not necessarily clean bass or quality bass. The good news is both of these speakers had very high quality bass. The clarity in the bass, which is a thing. The quickness of the bass, which is also a thing. When I listen to Intergalactic by the Beastie Boys though, not a surprise that the Sonus Faber Lumina 2 Amateurs did a better job than the Cambridge. But when I listened to The Chain by Fleetwood Mac with the bass drum coming in, it was almost kind of like a leathery slap at the beginning, and I could hear that on both speakers, which really impressed me. So which one wins for bass? Well, the Sonus Faber wins on amount of bass, and they're kind of tied for cleanliness and accuracy and tonality of the bass and clarity. Lena Hall, her cover of Creep, and if you haven't heard that song, you really need to go check it out. You can check it out on Tidal or Amazon. There'll be links in the description to try a free trial of both of those. Shameless plug. Oh, by the way, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing, or if you don't like me, please consider subscribing. You can do it right down here. It's tax season, and you have unlimited subscriptions to donate. They may be tax deductible. However, you may want to check with your tax professional to figure that out. Probably not. What was I talking about? Oh yeah, Lena Hall. If you haven't heard this track, she's super dynamic with her presentation. So she'll go way up in the register, and then she comes all the way down with like a whisper, and there's a huge spread, a huge delta in what notes she's hitting. So all the way to the top, all the way to the bottom. And that's always been a very good test of mid-range for a speaker because there is such a wide variety of how dynamic her voice is and the literal journey she takes us on with her vocals. Absolutely masterful. Here's the big surprise. I thought the Cambridge were more accurate in the mid-range. The reason I say that is because I feel like the Sonus Faber have a little bit of a boost between 300 to 500 hertz, which gives mid-range vocals body, but it takes away a little bit of the clarity. So the Cambridge actually win for that track. The Chain, again by Fleetwood Mac. This is where the Sonus Faber beat the Cambridge audio. With acoustic guitars, I felt like the Sonus Faber was more realistic, almost like when you hear someone playing an acoustic guitar and you're in the room with them and you hear kind of the interior of the guitar. There's like depth there. I didn't hear that with the, well, I'd heard it with the Cambridge, but it just wasn't as accurate as it was with the Sonus Faber. By the way, at the end of this video, I'm going to link another video about the Cambridge SX50 and how good it really is, especially when you compare it to other speakers at its price. So if you're interested, make sure to check that video out. The Cambridges, I also feel like have a bump around 2500 hertz, which is really good for female vocals, especially at lower volumes, because it gives you the perception of more clarity. But it can add a little bit of a cooler tone, and I heard that cooler tone with the Chain, not only in the acoustic guitars, but also in the vocals, because Stevie Nicks has a bit of a lower register than Lena Hall does. So although they both sound really good in the mid-range, it's going to be track dependent, but I feel like the Sonus Faber does a better job overall across multiple tracks. Keep in mind though, there's a little bit of heft around 500 hertz, which is going to cover up a bit of mid-range detail, especially with vocals that are lower vocals. The win for mid-range goes to the Sonus Faber, but keep in mind, some tracks out there actually sound better on the Cambridge. Treble. Interestingly enough, when I was listening to Intergalactic, which I use for bass, and by the way, the Sonus Faber is a lot punchier on the bottom than the Cambridge. I don't think that's probably surprising to anybody, considering it's got a bigger woofer and a bigger enclosure. Anyway, there was a bit of sibilance with Intergalactic that I heard through the Cambridge audio, which again makes sense because not only is there a bump or a peak at 2500 hertz, I think there's probably a bump or a peak around 4 to 6K. Outside of that though, when I played Harvester of Sorrow by Metallica, there's a lot of offbeat cymbals. And because it's an offbeat cymbal, you have a tendency to be able to hear more of the cymbal. The initial strike, stick to metal, and then the decay, quite spectacular for the Cambridges. And I think that's one of the kind of standout features with the Cambridge speakers. Even though you got some peaks in there, the reproduction, the, I guess, realistic rendering of cymbals is very good. It's also very good on the Sonus Fabers though. So the Sonus also win for treble, but it's not like a walk-away win, and it's really due to kind of the peaks that you get with the Cambridge and a little bit of sibilance that you get with the Cambridge. I don't hear any sibilance from the Sonus Faber. Is the Sonus Faber worth over 7 times the price of the Cambridge? Well, of course not, but it is better. The Lumina 2 Amateurs, I feel like, have a fuller sound on the bottom, and the only place that I think the Cambridge outshines them is with female vocals and male vocals too, because you do lose a bit of mid-range, but it's not throughout the entirety of the mid-range. But acoustic guitars actually sound better. It's going to be vocalist dependent. It's also going to be track dependent. But I think we have to keep in mind that at $200, there's got to be a very simple crossover inside. The enclosure construction can't be like super awesome when you compare it to something like a $1,500 speaker. So one needs to expect a few peaks and valleys in the frequency response. And the biggest surprise for me is that the Cambridge was not embarrassed at all over the entirety of the frequency range. The other thing to consider is if you're buying a $200 speaker, you buy a $330 Weem Ultra, which is a streamer as well as a preamp. That also has an EQ in it. Then you can add a $150 Fuzzy Audio ZA3 and a $300 RSL subwoofer. It's their most affordable subwoofer, and it's awesome. That whole package comes in at under $1,000. I think $980 if my math is correct. And for an extra $500, you could add a really awesome DAC, something from Gishelli Labs or something like that. So for less than a pair of the Sonus Fabers, you could have an entire system with EQ, with room correction, with a streamer, with a phono preamp, with analog inputs. You could have a whole system. So even though these sound better than these, it might not be the right choice for you. However, the Sonus Faber are fantastic, and when I did the video on the Sonus Faber, I was so impressed that I bought them. Still one of my favorite speakers. If you are on a budget though, I just did a video about how my budget speaker king is dead. And the reason why it's dead is because this speaker killed it. If you want to learn a lot more about the Cambridge Audio SX50, that video is right here. Also, I have new t-shirts. That link will be in the description. These are all screen printed, and I'm doing all of my t-shirt merch in-house now. So don't binge watch anything on Netflix or Hulu. Binge listen, maybe through your new Cheap Audio Man Rocktopus mug, which is also linked in the description, and fill your soul with happiness. So with that, I'm Randy. I'm the Cheap Audio Man.